Okay, we're very pleased today to have Brent Tyler, a noted lawyer and English rights activist here with us today for our interview. And Brent, I'd like to begin by asking you a few background questions for context. First of which is, where were your parents born?
My father was born in Brighton, England, and my mother was born in Ottawa.
Okay. And where were you born?
I was born in Ottawa as well, but my family was living in Nicolette, Quebec, which is a little village across the river from Trois-Rivières. My father worked for a federal government installation that tested military equipment in Nicolette. And my mother didn't trust the medical help in Nicolette, and there was no bridge between Nicolette and Trois-Rivières as there is now. So she decided that she was going to go to Ottawa to give birth to her children. And so that was the case for me and my twin sisters, who are a year younger than me. The youngest in the family didn't make it to Ottawa. She was born in Nicolette. The first Protestant child born in the parish of Nicolette in 200 years. They didn't even know how to register her birth, just to give you an idea. And anyway, the family moved to Drummondville because there was no, when my father went to the local parish priest to say that he wanted to send me and my three sisters to the parish school in Nicolette, he said, well, Monsieur Tyler, il y a un problème. And the problem was that we were Protestant. Now, in the late 50s, that was a serious issue in rural Quebec, and so as I said earlier, there was no bridge between Nicolette and Trois-Rivières. So the closest English school was in Drummondville, 50 miles away. So the family moved to Drummondville, and I started English school in Drummondville. Interestingly enough, the high school later closed. Drummondville High School had from kindergarten to grade 11, but there were fewer and fewer English people they couldn't justify. So they shipped us off to Richmond Regional High School in Richmond. So my father went 50 miles one way to go to work in Nicolette from Drummondville, and we went the other way, 25 miles, to go to school in Richmond. And that was the lot of the rural Anglo. If you lived in a rural setting, then you traveled to a regional school to go to school. Massivania is an example. Alexander Galt is another. Richmond Regional actually was the first one that tried this regional school setup. So the family moved to Drummondville, and I went to school in Richmond. And then I did my 2 years of CEGEP at John Abbott, and then moved to Lennoxville and did one term at Champlain. And then I started at Bishop's. I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and then I did my law degree at the University of Sherbrooke. So it wasn't until the spring of '84 that I moved to Montreal. I'd been hired by a large law firm to article there, and that's where I started my career. And I've been in Montreal ever since. So that's the shortened version of my background. Yeah.
But Brent, you made this extremely easy for me. You've answered all of the questions in one go. That's fantastic. I appreciate that. So we'll get into what I like to call the meat of the matter here. And I'll start off, these are just for recording purposes. These are questions concerning your experience living in Quebec today. So we'll start off by asking you, what is the best thing in your mind about living in Quebec at this moment in time?
Well, I'll have to answer the question by modifying it slightly and saying Montrealer, because I have very little sense of identity with the province of Quebec. I am a Canadian by citizenship, but in terms of my identity, I consider myself a Montrealer. I have also, of course, a whole township's identity from my past, but for right now, I consider my identity as a Montrealer to be the one that is the most influential on me. And so, and what I like about Montreal is it is a world-class, multicultural, multilingual, notwithstanding efforts by some to pretend that it's a French city. You can put whatever you want in a law, but the reality of Montreal is that it is ethnically and culturally diverse. So what I like about it, one of the things I like about it, I also like the fact that it is the meeting place of two world languages and cultures, and a place where both have managed to thrive and be, quite successful. And so I'll answer your question. What is the best thing about being a Montrealer is all the things I just described. The multilingual nature, the multicultural nature, the historical reunion of two world languages and culture. That's what I like about Montreal.
Okay. Now, the next question, a lot of people have trouble with it, and I would, certainly if it was asked of me. I'll preface it that by saying a lot of these questions are probably going to, your responses will be repeated, and that's okay, because I'm coming at issues from different angles and trying to get get to the same place via different framing of questions. So
Right.
I will ask you the next question. I'd like you to respond as written, but you're free to elaborate on your response as much as possible.
Right.
So having said that, describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
Almost impossible to do. But I understand the purpose of the question is to try and, and get me to edit down to the absolute essential. I don't know. It's hard. It's harder than I thought. When I read that question in the list of questions that you sent me, I said, province of birth, a province of origin. I mean, it's impossible to do with one word, and so I'll start by saying it's my province of residence in terms of actual reality. I have always been fascinated by the French fact. Drummondville is a very French town, and I think I had an exposure to the French fact that most Anglos do not have, and so it's my province of residence. It is my home province in terms of Canada, as a whole, and that's really the best I can do. I mean, I know this will come up in other questions too, in other ways, but that's what I'll say for now.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, the next one is, and you partially answered this okay already, and that's fine. Where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
Well, it's Montreal with respect to all of that. As I mentioned earlier, I have a special attachment to the townships because of my personal history. But I feel most at home in Montreal. I live in Verdun, and it's quite hilarious that over the summer, the Wellington Street was named the coolest street in the world by this. I don't know if you heard this or not. I live a half a block from Wellington, and I was thinking to myself, my God, I moved from Grosvenor Avenue when my wife and I separated, and I moved to the Point, and then I moved to Verdun, and I find myself living a half a block away from the coolest street in the world. Now, I don't believe that to be true. I've traveled too much in the world to know that as cool as it might be for some, there's streets in the world that are a whole lot cooler. But I like the idea that, you know, this thing was published. And I used to joke about, you know, the fact that I lived so close to it.
Now, the next question, again, people have trouble with it, and it's a two-parter. I'm going to talk about the second part a little bit because I'm sure you looked at it and said to yourself, well, you know, official definition according to who, which is the response I get. So I'll qualify that and tell you what we're after here. The official definition is as you perceive it to be. It could be the Quebec government's definition. It could be the federal government's definition. It could be the media's definition. It could be your peers' definition. Whatever you see as the so-called official definition is up to you. So having said that, I'll ask the two-parter and you can elaborate.
Right.
So how would you define a Quebecer or Quebecois? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Well, I would define a Quebecer as someone who is a resident of the province of Quebec. Now, that is, the official definition depends on who you ask. When ethnocentric nationalists talk about le peuple québécois, that does not include me. And the reason why it doesn't include me is that this notion of le peuple québécois is advanced, I think, in the context of, because all peoples have the right of self-determination. And so when nationalists talk about le peuple québécois, they're talking about white francophone Quebecers, descendants of the initial 60,000 settlers to New France. It does not include me because I don't want to be included in that definition. The problem with this whole notion of a definition of a Quebec people is that they will tell you, well, no, a member of the peuple québécois is anyone who resides in the province of Quebec, and that is simply not the case. In order to qualify as a member of le peuple québécois, the way it is coined by ethnocentric nationalists is to be a white Catholic, French-speaking person, and to I am not included in that group, objectively speaking, and I don't wish to belong to that group for the purposes of self-determination. For the purposes of self-determination, I am a member of the Canadian people. Now, the Canadian people doesn't have any ethnic or social or cultural limitation to it. It's you are a Canadian if you identify yourself as a Canadian, and self-identification is an important part of this, because as we as time goes on, there's more and more intermarriage between Anglos and Francos. I mean, it used to be that 1 in 5 Anglos had a Francophone spouse. Now it's 1 in 3. Now that's a very significant percentage of intermarriage. And what it means is when the children of those unions are to be asked, well, do you consider yourself French or English? Well, they're going to say, well, both. And that would be the best answer they could give. So, so I would define a Quebecer personally as a resident of Quebec, period. But I have to acknowledge that the official definition means a lot more than that, and is highly problematic. What's problematic in the use of the word le peuple québécois is that it purports to include everyone, whether they wish to be included for the purposes of self-determination or not. And I do not wish to be included in that notion. So,
okay, fair enough. Okay, well, that leads me into the next question. So has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
Well, hmm, well, it's changed in the sense that before law school, I really wasn't much interested in this whole notion of a political, legal, and constitutional quarrels about language. But I started law school in 1981, right after the 1980 referendum, and so it was a very, very. I was the only Anglo-Federalist in my section at law school, so I had an opportunity to debate these issues all the time, whether I liked it or not, and so it was. I would have to say, then I started becoming more aware of what I would call the dangers of ethnocentric nationalism when it comes to language policy. I mean, when you consider what has happened to the English-speaking community, I described what happened to Drummondville. I mean, the exodus was massive. We went from having 2 schools, one Protestant, one Catholic, from kindergarten to grade 11, to having no schools and having to travel 25 miles from the age of 5, kindergarten. Now, there's since been an elementary school opened up in Drummondville, but it wasn't the case when I was going there. We used to have 5 churches, and they are all closed now except for one. And St. George's Anglican Church is right in the middle of downtown Drummondville, and it was the prettiest architecturally. So the Anglos in Drummondville decided that they would join together in one congregation and maintain this St. George's Anglican Church. So all the Catholics and the Baptists, everyone on the United Church, they're all Anglicans now, if they want to continue to go to Sunday service. So, and then of course at the macro level, 400,000 net out migration of English-speaking people from the province of Quebec. And I mean, my own family, I mean, if I want to go and visit my nieces and nephews, they're close. Well, one lives in Ottawa, another lives in Toronto, and another lives in the Okanagan Valley. But the point is, they all left after university, like so many, and we all have, as English-speaking people, we all have stories about how our families are no longer here, it's so. What has happened to the English-speaking community is I think something that was it possible to avoid? Perhaps not. But let me just give you one personal example. My mother was the school nurse at Richmond Regional High School. And she did an extremely good job, was very well liked. But in '77, when Bill 101 came into force, everyone was required to pass a language competency test if they wanted to become a member of or stay a member of a professional corporation. So, my mother was raised in Ottawa, never really had an opportunity to learn French, and was one of those people that did not take well to learning a second language as an adult. So she passed 3 of the 4 components of the language test, but repeatedly failed the French expression portion of the test. Now, bear in mind that she didn't have to speak in French at all in her job. She had English students, English teachers, English administration, English school board, English everything. And so, she didn't need French to do her job, but yet she needed French to pass the test to keep her position to be a member of the Order of Nurses. And so she tried and couldn't do it. So finally she went to the local M&A to plead for her case, saying, listen, here's my situation. I mean, there has to be some ability to accommodate someone like me. I do a very good job. And she had these glowing letters from all of the staff at the school saying it would be a tremendous loss for the school if she was. Anyway, his name was Jutras. and he was a member of the Parti Québécois. And after he heard my mother out, he said to her, "Madame, it's our turn now." So, I was thinking to myself, well, this is really this is the ugly face of ethnocentric nationalism, and it is the prevailing party. I mean, the big you are in power, it's an example. I'm sure that other people have stories that are equally horrendous to tell, but I thought that was absolutely unforgivable, and still do. But it's an example of the ugly face of ethnocentric nationalism. And so anyway, that I guess is enough of my answer for that one. That's
No, that's fair. Now, again, at the risk of me repeating the question of which you've already answered, I'm going to do it anyway.
sure.
What are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec?
Well, the sort of attitude I just mentioned is very regrettable. This linguistic chauvinism, nous sommes au Québec, parle français, is I find very uncivilized, very regrettable. Now, thankfully, doesn't happen very often, right? I mean, the vast majority of French-speaking Quebecers are decent and civilized, respectful people, but there are some that aren't. And so I would say that is perhaps the most disagreeable thing about living in Quebec, is people that think that they have some sort of special right, the connection between blood and soil, that someone like me does not have. And so that I find regrettable. But as I say, thankfully, it doesn't, there's not that many people that suffer from that particular, linguistic chauvinism. But the government itself, with its policies, I mean, when you read Bill 96, you realize why they had to invoke the notwithstanding clause. I mean, on the face of it, it is discrimination based on language. It breaches any one of several rights guaranteed by the Canadian and Quebec charters of rights. So that's disagreeable. I find the unfortunate thing about living in Quebec is that this ethnocentric nationalism, it's like a virus that has infected all areas of our society, including, I would say, the judiciary. It would be naive to think that, as far-reaching as this virus is, that judges somehow remain immune. I mean, I've had some modest success in front of the courts in litigating language issues, but I almost always lose in the lower courts. It's only when I get up higher that these rights are vindicated. And why? Because the judges, most of the judges that I appeared in first instance, were infected with this virus, and they wrote judgments that reflect that. Now, because we have a legal system that works, and an appeal process for these judgments, most, if not all, of these judgments were ultimately overturned by the Court of Appeal and ultimately the Supreme Court. But it remains that this virus has infected virtually all of the Francophone elite, the academic elite, the media elite, the professional elite. It's there, and it's very deeply entrenched. And so that's I think one of the things that I find most difficult about living here.
Okay. Now, the next question, we had to craft this very carefully because it's an attempt to drill down to specific issues. So we worded it in such a way, but I mean, it's quite obvious what we're getting at here. I'll ask it. In recent years, Quebec's Francophone majority has identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support? And which of these concerns make you feel excluded and targeted?
Well, the number one threat that I think most Francophones feel is the sentiment that their language is declining to the point where it will eventually disappear. And you've heard Premier Legault talk about the Louisianization of Quebec. In other words, this inevitable demographic trend will ultimately result in Quebec being a place where French is not the majority of the language of the population, and the French language will eventually go the way of the French language in Louisiana. This is so outrageous as a claim to make. The demographic evidence is such that, yes, while there is a decline in the relative weight, the percentage of mother tongue Francophones compared to the population as a whole, in every other indicator of demographic vitality, Quebec is either neutral or doing just fine. So to say because of one demographic factor that the French language is on the verge of declining to the point of disappearing, to say that is just unbelievably, it's demagoguery. I mean, it's politicians, unscrupulous politicians are using it to make people feel afraid and insecure in their language. So that they Bill 96 is an example. They come up with this legislation which is meant to address that issue to the detriment of people that speak all other languages and all other cultural backgrounds. So the one thing that I find unfortunate is the extent to which this notion that the French language is in decline to the point of being on its way to extinction it seems to be very widely held among the Francophone population, even though it is demographically speaking, scientifically speaking, untenable. It's just not true. The facts are not there, and yet it's a widely held belief among the Francophone population. So one of the things that I remain hopeful when I look at the situation is I get young Francophone parents calling me all the time because my name is associated with access to English schools. They're aware that I've had, a few court cases that have been successful on this whole notion of access. And so they call me up and they say, I want to send my kid to an English school. And I feel like saying to them, well, where have you been for the last 30 years? The purpose of Bill 101 is to force you to send your children to a French school, and also all immigrants. And they say to me inevitably, oh, I thought it was only immigrants. I thought it applied only to immigrants. No, it applies to you as well. You are not allowed to send your kid to an English school unless there's a couple of ways you could do it, but those loopholes have been closing. So anyway, the reason why I raise this is that these young parents do not have the sense of historical grievance that their parents did. They are more open to the English language. They don't consider the whole issue of independence, even in their top 5 items of priority. So I daydream about a day that comes when these young people, as they get older and acquire more economic and political influence, there'll come a time when Bill 101 will be weakened because the attitude will be we don't need that. We don't need coercive legislation to promote our language. It's up to us to make sure that the French language survives and is healthy, and we teach it properly to our children. And because I think, and this is the unfortunate thing about Bill 101, by adopting an approach of coercive legislation, it almost does not properly take into account the fact of human nature. When human beings are forced to do something, they will resist. And you're always much better off to use a carrot rather than a stick. And this has almost become a truism. And so one of the greatest fears I have about Bill 101 is that it'll backfire, and in the sense that its attempt to promote the French language will ultimately result in immigrants who come here and say, no, I was forced to adopt this language. I don't feel, I didn't voluntarily do it. And as a result, their sense of loyalty and belonging to the French language group will be compromised. But we'll see. That's speculation on my part. But it seems to me that it is wrong-headed to try and promote and defend the French language by using coercive legislation to do it. You ultimately will not succeed in your goal if that's what you're trying to do. So I don't know.
You've probably answered the next question several times.
Okay.
It's kind of a motherhood question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is the biggest problem facing Quebec, and how, in your mind, do you think it could be resolved?
Well, it's the ethnocentric nationalism that I mentioned earlier, but in terms of specifics, I'm going to say that immigration and the manpower shortage is a much bigger issue over time than people take it for now. I mean, when you have the Conseil du Patronat, the leading employers group in the province, saying we need 100,000 minimum immigration annually to respond to our demands in the labor force. And then you have Legault, on the other hand, who says not more than 50. So you have a situation where the well-being economics of the province are going to be compromised. Companies will not come here if they can't find employees to work for them. Companies that, pardon me, companies that are here will leave because they can't find workers. And you're already hearing noises like that a little bit already. You're hearing that now. But in 5 years, that will be an accumulated deficit of 250,000 workers. So this might be the soft underbelly of the whole ethnocentric nationalist project, is if their economic well-being is compromised, seriously compromised, I think Quebecers will be less likely to adopt ethnocentric positions, because they will see the connection between their economic well-being and these policies, that it results in a situation where collectively we are poorer as a result of these policies. And so we have to change them. So the biggest problem facing Quebec will not be felt for some time, but it's immigration. We are going to have to double our immigration levels just to remain economically competitive. And if we don't do that, we will collectively, I think, regret it, because companies won't come here. And if they are here and can leave, they'll leave. I can't name them, but I have 2 clients right now who came to me initially to help them deal with the changes in Bill 96 to the franchisation provisions. Before, it used to be 50 employees and more, and you were subject to getting a franchisation certificate. Well, now it's down to 25. And so these 2 clients became subject to the rigors of the franchisation provisions in the Charter of the French language as a result of Bill 96. And in the course of working through what it would cost them in terms of compliance, they both said, no, we're not staying, we're leaving. And they're going to take their brains, their capital, and probably most of their employees with them. And so that is a huge problem. And I don't think, it's the debate's happening now, but the full consequences of what this means over time, I don't think has been fully appreciated. When you have the Conseil du Patronat saying we need to double our immigration levels, and with the current government, that's not going to happen. That's just not going to happen. Legault has said time and time again. He actually said that immigration was suicidal for the French language. I mean, so we'll see how that plays out, but I have an idea that it's going to have it's going to have a huge impact on the whole ethnocentric nationalist movement in Quebec. And it might be that brings it down. That will bring it down more than anything else, more than the public opinion in other countries, more than the courts. I have an idea that this will really be a game changer.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about the next question before I ask it, and ask you a question outside of this. Have you had a chance to see Guy Rogers' great documentary, What We Choose to Remember?
I saw it. I think I mentioned this to you during our conversation.
Oh, at the Thirsty Boot, right?
I saw it at the Thirsty Boot, and incidentally, Susan and Keith were there.
Yeah, no, Susan mentioned that was the last time she saw you.
That was the last time I saw them.
Well, the reason I asked that is Guy's not only a friend of mine, but also is a consulting producer in this effort and has helped me and Brian formulate some of these questions. So I mentioned that in passing, but you might have noticed that in his documentary, he used what I'm about to use on you very effectively as a visual tool. Indicate by a show of fingers. I learned that, and it is a very effective visual tool as you're editing through the answers to the questions. So I'll go ahead and ask you that now that I've given you some background. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest, indicate by a show of fingers, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges?
Notwithstanding everything I've said about the dangers of ethnocentric nationalism.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, Brent, here's your opportunity to say anything else you'd like to say. So is there anything else you'd like to say about your sense of identity or belonging?
Yeah, I would. I mean, and I guess it was because I had the father that I had. My father was in the British Army and stayed in the Army after the war. And when he was ready to retire from the British Army, he was looking around for work, and the federal government had a position available at their installation in Nicolette. And so he moved there and was literally adopted by the local Francophone community. I mean, he was a bit unusual in terms of, he's 6'4" Brit, finds himself in the middle of Duplessis, rural Quebec, and finds himself, totally falling in love with the people and the culture. And there was an openness shown to him by French-speaking Quebecers at the time that influenced him his entire life. And when my parents' relationship broke, when they eventually separated, my mother moved back to Ottawa, but my father moved to Trois-Rivières, and he met, or he'd known from before, but he started a second relationship with a woman from Trois-Rivières, Irene Rousseau. And the Rousseau family was one of these old Trois-Rivières families. Her father was the mayor for many, many years. He was the MP for a lot of years. And so my father and Irene were now they couldn't get married because my father, she was a devout Catholic. She was a widow, but my father was a divorced man, and her faith prevented her from, but they spent they ate every meal together, they traveled together, and it was like a second family, okay? And to the point where when it came time for my father to be buried after he passed away, the Rousseau family insisted, and my family didn't have any objection, that he be buried in the Rousseau family plot of the Roman Catholic cemetery in Trois-Rivières. The problem was, because he was Protestant, we had to get the permission of the bishop, the archbishop, to allow him to be buried in the Catholic cemetery. The Rousseau family had a lot of weight, so they made the request and it was granted. But if you're walking through, I don't suppose you'd ever have any reason to, but for someone walking through the Catholic cemetery in Trois-Rivières, exclusively Francophone names, and a big area of the cemetery is the Rousseau family plot because they ran the funeral home. Rousseau et Frères was the funeral home the funeral home. So you see all these Francophone names, then you come to the Rousseau family plot, and there's John Albert Brent Tyler, a prominent, headstone. And so what I would like to say about that, it was indicative of the warmth that my father felt from the minute he came to Quebec. He was well received by Francophones, and it carried through to the even deciding where he's buried. It was so that's what I like about Quebec, and why one of the reasons why I would never leave is that notwithstanding their susceptibility to being tempted by the siren song of ethnocentric nationalism, as a people, French Canadians are, and it's almost stereotypical, but it's true. If you've lived here any length of time, you know it's true. There's a warmth and a sociability there, which is extremely likable and desirable, and that's one of the reasons why I stay.
Okay, Brent, I'm going to stop the recording shortly, but before I do, I just wanted to officially thank you very much for your insight. It was truly unique. It was a very good perspective, and I thank you for your time and agreeing to be part of this process.
Well, you probably figured out that I like doing this kind of thing anyway. I mean, it's fun. It's fun to me to talk about language and identity and those issues there, because they're very important to human beings, these notions of identity and belonging. I've always been fascinated by them.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. I'm going to stop recording now, and we could talk a little